During the first savage snowstorm of the winter, an 88-year-old woman pushed her way into a small Wyoming diner and begged for a single bowl of hot soup, not for herself, but for her disabled son, freezing alone inside a collapsing cabin deep in the woods. Most of the people in that diner looked away. One waiter tried to shove her back out into the storm, but before she could fall, a quiet U.S. Marine and his German Shepherd stepped between them. And what Nathan Cole found inside that frozen cabin would lead him to a forgotten hero, a family slowly dying in the cold, and a secret that had been quietly destroying their lives for years. If this story stays with you, do me a favor before we begin. Subscribe, ring the bell, and stay until the very end. Heavy snow buried Silver Creek, Wyoming before noon, turning the highway into a white blur of ice, wind, and frozen dark. The old diner off Route 26 stayed packed anyway. Truckers warmed their hands around coffee mugs, while locals waited out the storm beneath the buzzing yellow lights and the smell of bacon grease. Sergeant Nathan Cole sat alone in a booth near the front window, his German Shepherd stretched out beside him on the floor. At 42, Nathan carried the rough, weathered look of a Marine who'd spent too many years outdoors and too many nights sleeping with one eye open. His olive-field shirt stretched across shoulders hardened by service, and a few days of beard shadowed a sharp jaw marked by an old scar near the chin. Most people in town respected him, but kept their distance. Nathan rarely said more than he had to, and since leaving the Corps he'd lived alone out near Fremont Lake, with no company but Rex. Rex lifted his head before the diner door even opened. The 5-year-old dog had a rich amber and black coat, sharp, intelligent eyes, and the disciplined stillness of an animal trained to spot trouble before any human could. One ear stood straight up while the other bent slightly from an old injury overseas. Nathan trusted Rex more than he trusted most people. A second later, the door swung open, and freezing wind exploded into the room alongside an elderly woman caked in snow. The conversations dropped almost at once. The woman paused just inside the entrance, as if gathering her strength before taking another step. Margaret Doyle was 88 years old, painfully thin beneath a worn gray coat, faded by years of brutal winters. Wisps of silver hair escaped her knitted cap, and her pale, lined face carried the exhausted look of someone surviving one hard day at a time. And yet there was a quiet dignity in the way she held herself straight despite the cold shaking through her body. She made her way slowly to the counter, where Trent Holloway stood pouring coffee with visible irritation. Trent was 27, broad through the chest, with tired eyes and the permanent frustration of a man angry at life more than at any particular person. "Excuse me," Margaret asked softly. "Could I buy some soup?" Trent barely glanced up. "Menu's over there. I just need something warm," she said quietly. "Maybe soup and a little bread." That made him look at her properly, across the worn clothes and the wet boots. "You got enough money?" Margaret carefully opened an old coin purse. A few crumpled bills and scattered coins sat inside. "My son is sick," she whispered. "He hasn't eaten since yesterday." Nathan stopped eating. Beside the booth, Rex stood and stared straight at Margaret, then crossed to her without waiting for permission. He pressed his nose to the hem of her coat, then to the scarf around her neck, and suddenly his whole body stiffened. Nathan felt his stomach tighten. Rex only reacted that way around blood, fear, or sickness. Margaret looked down in surprise, then gently touched the side of the dog's head. "You're beautiful," she whispered. Rex stayed at her side. Trent sighed loudly behind the counter. "Look, ma'am, we can't feed everybody who walks in here." Margaret shook her head quickly. "I'm not asking for charity. I just need something soft enough for him to swallow." "And where's your son?" Trent asked. "At home." "Then why didn't he come himself?" The pain that crossed Margaret's face answered before her words did. He can't walk. A brief silence settled over the diner. Outside, the snow hammered the windows harder while the wind screamed across the highway. Nathan watched Margaret lower her eyes, as if embarrassed simply to exist in front of all these people, and something about that bothered him more than it should have. He'd seen that exact expression in military hospitals overseas, on exhausted family members sitting beside beds long after hope should have run out. He pushed himself to his feet and walked to the counter. At 6'3", he towered over most people without trying. Rex returned to his side. "Put it on my bill," Nathan said calmly. Margaret turned to him at once. "No, sir, you don't have to do that." "Soup," Nathan interrupted quietly, pulling money from his wallet. "Bread, too. And a coffee." Trent took the bills and disappeared into the kitchen. Margaret looked overwhelmed. "Thank you," she whispered. "Really?" Nathan nodded once, then noticed her hands more carefully. Tiny cuts across the fingers, old burn marks, skin cracked from the cold. The hands of someone still chopping wood and tending a fire at nearly 90. When the soup arrived, Margaret immediately wrapped the hot container inside her coat to hold the heat. Nathan frowned. "You're not eating?" "He needs it more." The answer settled heavy in his chest. He glanced at the storm again. The snow had already buried most of the highway, and the back roads would soon be impossible. "You drive here?" he asked. Margaret hesitated, then shook her head. Nathan stared at her. "You walked?" Another silence, then she nodded once. Nobody spoke after that. Even Trent looked uncomfortable now. Nathan's instincts sharpened. An 88-year-old woman did not walk through a Wyoming blizzard unless the situation at home was bad enough to terrify her. Rex growled low under his breath, staring at Margaret's scarf again, and when Nathan looked closer, he finally saw the small, dark stain near the fabric. Blood. Fresh. His whole body tightened. "How sick is your son?" he asked quietly. Margaret lowered her eyes. "The fever keeps getting worse." "How long?" 3 days. "You seen a doctor?" She said nothing. Nathan exhaled slowly through his nose. Poverty, isolation, pride. He'd seen combinations like that before, and they rarely ended well. Margaret clutched the soup tighter, as if afraid it might vanish before she got home. "I should go," she murmured. "The soup will get cold." Nathan grabbed his jacket from the booth while Rex moved toward the door. Deep down, he already knew he wasn't letting this woman walk back into the storm alone. The trouble was the feeling rising in his chest, something he'd spent years avoiding since leaving the Corps. Responsibility, attachment, the dangerous instinct to care what happened to someone again. He pulled the door open, and the freezing wind blasted through the room. "I'll drive you home," he said. Margaret shook her head at once. "You've already done enough." Nathan looked at the exhaustion in her face, then at Rex, whose body stayed tense beside her as if the dog already sensed something waiting out beyond the snow-covered road. "No," Nathan answered quietly. "I don't think I have." 20 minutes later, his truck pushed deeper into the frozen pine forest north of Silver Creek, while the snow erased the road behind them. Margaret sat silent in the passenger seat, clutching the soup to her chest like it mattered more than her own life. Rex upright between them, ears alert. Then, through the storm, Nathan finally saw it. A weak flicker of light, barely visible between the trees beside what looked like a collapsing cabin half buried in snow. And for the first time that night, he understood. The old woman beside him hadn't walked into town because she was hungry. She'd walked into town because she believed her son might not survive until morning. The cabin shook in the storm while the snow climbed the windows higher every hour. Nathan spent most of the night rebuilding the dead wood stove and sealing the cracks in the walls with old blankets he found in a storage chest by the kitchen. The place barely deserved to be called a home anymore. Frost crawling along the ceiling corners, the pipes under the sink frozen solid, water dripping from one side of the roof into a rusted bucket on the table. Rex stayed beside Daniel's bed the whole time, watching the former firefighter with the same focus he once used around wounded Marines overseas, lifting his head to sniff the air whenever Daniel's coughing worsened. Margaret carefully fed her son the soup, cooling every spoonful before handing it over the way she'd clearly done hundreds of times. Nathan noticed she never made anything for herself. A second bowl sat untouched beside the stove while she pretended not to look at it. "You should eat too," Nathan finally said, adding another log to the fire. Margaret shook her head quickly. "I had something earlier." Daniel gave a weak, tired laugh from the bed. "She says that every day." Margaret avoided both their eyes. In the firelight, Nathan could finally see how worn down she really was, her hands trembling constantly now, her face pale and hollow, like someone living mostly on coffee and hot water. The realization settled hard in his chest. This 88-year-old woman had walked through a blizzard not for herself, but because her paralyzed son hadn't eaten in nearly 2 days. Rex rested his head against Daniel's blanket. Daniel looked surprised, then scratched behind the dog's ear with rough, scarred fingers. "He likes you," Nathan said. Daniel studied the dog quietly. Dogs usually do. His voice stayed low and tired. "People are harder." Nathan glanced at the old photograph by the bed. A younger Daniel standing beside a red fire engine in full turnout gear, broad-shouldered, smiling at the camera, his hair thicker, his posture straighter. Beside the frame sat several medals under a layer of dust. "You were fire department," Nathan said. Daniel nodded once. "Bozeman, Montana, 23 years." Nathan pulled a chair closer to the stove and sat while the snow hammered the roof. Daniel stared into the fire a long moment, deciding whether an old memory was worth reopening. "Apartment building fire, 8 years ago," he muttered. 3 floors, families trapped upstairs. He swallowed hard. "We got most of them out before the second floor came down." Nathan looked at the motionless legs beneath the blankets. "Spinal injury?" Steel beam through the ceiling. Daniel forced a bitter smile. Didn't even feel it at first. "1 minute I was carrying a little girl down the stairwell. Next thing I remember is waking up in a hospital with doctors talking like my life was already over." Margaret lowered her eyes. Nathan could tell she'd heard this many times, and it still cut her every time. Daniel coughed into the blanket, then went on. "Insurance fought almost everything. Said parts of the surgery weren't fully covered." He laughed weakly. "Funny how people love firefighters until the bills show up." His face tightened. "My wife stayed about 6 months before she left." "Daniel," Margaret whispered. "It's fine, Mom." He looked back at Nathan. "Can't blame her. Nobody signs up for this kind of life." Nathan understood the look in Daniel's eyes, because he'd seen versions of it inside VA hospitals after deployments. Men who'd spent their whole lives protecting other people often broke differently when the world stopped needing them. Not loudly. Quietly, like buildings collapsing from the inside. "The debt took the house after that," Daniel continued. "Mom sold almost everything to keep me out of a state facility." His eyes drifted toward Margaret in the chair nearby. "Now she spends winters chopping wood at 88 because of me." Margaret shook her head. "Stop saying that. It's true." "No," she answered softly. "You're my son." The room went quiet but for the crackling fire. Nathan watched Daniel turn his face away after those words. Shame sat on him heavier than the fever did. Nathan recognized that too. Around midnight, Margaret finally fell asleep sitting upright by the stove, still in her coat because the cabin was too cold to fully relax. Nathan draped another blanket over her shoulders while Daniel watched from the bed. "She used to play piano every Sunday at church," Daniel said suddenly. 30 years. His voice sounded far away now. "Now look at her." Nathan followed his gaze to the old woman sleeping in the weak firelight. "She stayed," Nathan answered quietly. Daniel stared at the ceiling a long moment. "You should take her when the storm clears." Nathan frowned. "What?" "She shouldn't die out here." Daniel's jaw tightened painfully, his eyes dropping toward his useless legs. "This place is killing her, and I'm the reason she's trapped in it." Nathan leaned back in the chair as the wind screamed through the trees hard enough to shake the walls. He understood what Daniel was really asking. It wasn't self-pity. It was guilt, the kind that slowly destroys good men after years of believing everyone would be better off without them. "She's not leaving you," Nathan finally said. Daniel closed his eyes, because they both already knew it was true. The fire burned low near dawn, while the snow climbed nearly halfway up the windows. Nathan woke when Rex lifted his head and growled deep in his throat, then stood and moved to the front window with his ears raised high. Nathan followed. At first he saw nothing but trees and falling snow. Then headlights appeared slowly between the pines near the edge of the property. A dark SUV, partly hidden beyond the road, engine running. Daniel caught Nathan's expression instantly. "What is it?" Nathan kept staring through the glass. "Someone's outside." Daniel's whole face changed. Fear replaced the exhaustion at once. "Oh God," he whispered. Nathan turned back. "You know that vehicle?" Daniel looked at the window like a man staring at a nightmare returning for him. "It means they finally found us." By the time Nathan reached the porch, the SUV was gone, leaving only tire tracks half buried in fresh snow. Rex stood rigid at the door, a growl still trapped in his throat, while Daniel watched from the bed with fear he no longer bothered to hide. Margaret held her robe closed by the stove, her thin face pale in the lantern light. And for the first time since Nathan met her, she looked less ashamed than afraid. He checked the road and the tree line and the prints by the gate, but the storm was already covering everything. Whoever had come hadn't wanted a confrontation. They'd wanted the family to know they'd been found. By morning, the storm softened into gray, drifting snow. Nathan stayed long enough to haul in more wood and patch the broken window by the kitchen. Margaret tried to make coffee with shaking hands, still pretending the small breakfast was enough for everyone, while Daniel watched her with the tired anger of a man who couldn't stand being protected by someone so frail. Then Nathan noticed a canvas folder tucked under a stack of old towels near the table, its edge marked with a neat blue logo, Northern Family Recovery Services. The name sounded harmless, but Daniel's face tightened before Nathan even touched it. "Don't open that," Daniel said. "Why?" Margaret lowered her eyes. "Because that's where everything started." Nathan sat and opened it anyway, slowly enough that it didn't feel like an accusation. Inside were hospital bills, disability forms, overdue notices, and several clean documents printed on expensive paper. The phrases were polite, but ugly once he read them twice. Temporary Property Protection Agreement, Financial Stabilization Authorization, Medical Debt Coordination Services. Every page promised help, and every promise created another fee, another permission, another quiet piece of control, handed over to strangers. Margaret twisted her wedding ring while he read, eyes on the floor as if the shame belonged to her instead of the people who wrote the papers. "They came after Daniel's accident," she said softly. "A woman from that office called first. said they helped families who were overwhelmed. Daniel gave a bitter laugh. They knew exactly which word to use. Margaret nodded faintly. They brought groceries. Helped me call the insurance. One man said the house could be protected while we handled the medical debt. Her voice thinned. I thought they were kind. Nathan turned a page and found a list of monthly charges that started small, then grew until they no longer looked like help at all. Coordination fee. Document recovery fee. Emergency advisory fee. He'd seen enough broken systems to recognize language built to exhaust people into obedience. Daniel had been recovering from spinal surgery. Margaret had been old, terrified, and alone. And someone had walked into that weakness wearing a smile. Anger rose in Nathan, but he kept his voice steady, because anger would only make Margaret shrink further. They were taking money from you, he said. Margaret closed her eyes. They said it was temporary. Daniel stared at the ceiling. They always said temporary. Temporary help. Temporary control. Temporary protection. His jaw tightened. Then we lost the house. Nathan looked at the papers again, and the pattern grew clearer. Northern Family Recovery Services hadn't simply offered charity. They'd latched onto Daniel's medical crisis and used paperwork to turn assistance into authority. The family's old home pulled into property protection, their accounts into stabilization, their debt into a maze Margaret couldn't possibly fight while caring for a paralyzed son. Nathan folded the documents back into the folder, but his mind was already on the next step. This wasn't about soup or fever or one freezing cabin anymore. This was about someone still close enough to watch them at night. That afternoon he drove into Silver Creek with copies tucked under his jacket and stopped at the county sheriff's office, a low brick building crusted with salt and snow, to find Deputy Claire Bennett. Claire was 38, tall and lean, dark blonde hair tied back under a winter cap, sharp green eyes that missed very little. She had the practical calm of someone who'd spent years walking into ugly rooms and refusing to look away. Nathan had known her since a search and rescue call 2 winters back, when she'd treated Rex like a working partner instead of a pet, enough to make Nathan trust her more than most. Claire read the first page in silence, then the second. By the third, her mouth had tightened. I've heard this name. Nathan leaned forward. From who? Older people, widows, disabled men, families with medical debt. She tapped the paper. Mostly Wyoming and Montana. The problem is they make people sign just enough to make it look voluntary. And the SUV? Claire looked up. If they're watching the cabin, that changes things. Write down times, plates if you can, anything Rex reacts to. Don't confront them alone. Nathan gave her a dry look. Claire didn't smile. I mean it, Cole. When Nathan got back near dusk, the cabin looked warmer than the night before. Margaret had folded the blankets by the stove. Daniel had eaten half a bowl of beans, and Rex lay where he could see both the bed and the door. It shouldn't have felt like coming home, but for one strange second it did. Nathan had lost his mother when he was 14, and after that he'd learned not to need the sound of anyone waiting for him in a kitchen. The Marines had only made that lesson harder and cleaner. But Margaret looked up when he came in and asked if the roads were bad, and Daniel muttered that Rex had stolen the warmest spot by the fire, and something in Nathan's chest shifted before he could stop it. He set the groceries on the counter and told them what Claire had said. Margaret's hands went still. Daniel looked toward the window before Rex did, as if the fear had already trained him where to look. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then tires crunched outside, slow and deliberate. Rex rose instantly, a deep growl rolling through the room as headlights swept across the frozen window, and stopped. Nathan moved toward the door. Calm now, in the way he only became calm when danger finally had a shape. Outside, the same black SUV sat at the edge of the property, engine running, waiting in the snow. The SUV stopped appearing after that night, but no one inside the house truly relaxed again. Margaret flinched whenever headlights passed through the trees after dark, and Daniel grew quieter each day, spending hours staring into the fire like a man bracing for disaster. Nathan kept bringing wood, food, and medicine, though by now it no longer felt like charity. Rex slept beside Daniel every night and followed Margaret room to room during the day, as if the old dog understood she carried the most fear inside her. 3 days after Claire's visit, Helen Brooks arrived with 2 thick folders under her arm and snow frozen along the hem of her dark coat. She sat at the kitchen table by the lantern while Margaret nervously folded and unfolded the same dish towel in her lap. Helen spent nearly an hour going through the paperwork, marking sections with a pen while Daniel watched silently from the bed. This organization knew exactly who they were targeting, Helen finally said. Most of these contracts are built around emotional distress, hospital debt, funeral costs, isolation. She looked at Margaret gently. People already exhausted enough to trust someone offering help. Margaret lowered her eyes. I should have read everything better. Mom, but Margaret shook her head. I signed the papers. Nathan leaned against the wall by the stove, arms folded. They manipulated you. That doesn't change my name being on them. The shame in her voice filled the room heavier than the winter silence outside. And Nathan realized then that Northern Family Recovery Services had stolen more than money or property. They'd convinced people like Margaret that being deceived was the same thing as being foolish. Helen seemed to understand it too. You're not the only victim, she said softly. That finally made Margaret look up. Over the next week, Helen and Claire gathered statements across Wyoming and Montana from other families tied to the organization. Nathan drove with them twice through snow-buried highways and isolated mountain towns where old widows lived alone beside frozen ranch land. Again and again they heard the same stories. Disabled veterans drowning in medical bills. Elderly couples tricked into temporary property agreements. Families approached after funerals by smiling representatives carrying casseroles and legal folders. One old woman outside Cody admitted she'd stopped answering her phone entirely after losing her home, too embarrassed to explain what had happened. A former Army mechanic with severe lung disease confessed he'd signed papers without reading them because the representatives kept calling him sir and speaking kindly while he struggled to breathe through an oxygen tube. Helen documented every case while Claire connected account records and transfers across counties. By the time they returned to Silver Creek, the case had become impossible to ignore. Still, Margaret resisted the hearing. Nathan found her late one night sitting alone by the stove, Rex asleep across her feet, the cabin dark but for firelight on her face. She looked exhausted beyond her age, worn down by years of survival and months of humiliation. I can't sit in front of strangers explaining how stupid I was, she whispered. Nathan was quiet a moment. You walked through a blizzard at 88 to keep your son alive. He glanced toward Daniel sleeping in the next room. That's not weakness. Margaret's eyes filled, though she fought hard not to cry. You don't understand. When people hear stories like this, they look at old women like me and think we deserved it. Nathan shook his head slowly. No, good people hear stories like this and wonder who could do something that cruel. The hearing took place at the Casper County Courthouse under a gray sky heavy with snow clouds. Nathan drove Margaret and Daniel there before sunrise, Rex alert in the back seat the whole trip. Daniel hated leaving the cabin while still weak, but he refused to let his mother face the courtroom alone. Margaret wore her best dark coat and kept smoothing it over her knees whenever her nerves worsened. The courthouse felt cold even inside, Old stone walls, fluorescent light, the smell of wet boots and paper. Rex stayed beside Daniel's wheelchair while Nathan handled the paperwork near the doors. Claire arrived first with 2 evidence boxes. Then, Helen with a stack of statements from victims across multiple counties. Then, Victor Hale appeared. The attorney for Northern Family Recovery Services looked polished enough for a television commercial. Mid-50s, silver hair carefully combed, expensive navy suit, smooth, confident smile. He greeted people politely, shook hands with court staff, and carried himself like a man certain the room already belonged to him. Nathan disliked him instantly because he recognized the type. Men who weaponized calm against frightened people. Once proceedings began, Victor tried to control the room at once, describing the organization as a humanitarian group assisting vulnerable families through financial instability, calling the agreements voluntary, suggesting any confusion came from emotional stress rather than fraud. Then he questioned Margaret directly. "Mrs. Doyle," he said gently, "nobody physically forced you to sign these contracts, correct?" Her hands trembled in her lap. "No. And representatives provided assistance after your son's accident?" "Yes," he nodded slowly, like a patient teacher guiding someone fragile. "So these agreements were entered willingly during a difficult period in your life." Nathan saw Daniel's face darken. Rex lifted his head, sensing the tension before anyone moved. Helen objected twice, but Victor kept steering every answer toward the same conclusion. An elderly woman embarrassed by choices she'd made of her own free will. Then, Margaret looked up. The room went completely silent. "My son couldn't walk," she said quietly. "I was 88 years old chopping wood alone in winter because I was afraid he'd freeze in the night." Her voice shook once, then steadied. "I walked through snowstorms begging restaurants for soup because Daniel was too sick to eat solid food." She looked directly at Victor Hale now. "Your people came smiling to my door while I was terrified. Nobody interrupted. They prayed with me. They promised to protect our home." Tears stood in her eyes, but never fell. Instead, they took the last pieces of dignity my family had left. The silence afterward felt heavier than shouting. Helen followed with financial records, witness statements, and transfers connected across counties, and Claire tied the organization to repeated property seizures involving elderly victims in isolated northern communities. By late afternoon, the judge approved a formal investigation and temporarily froze Northern Family Recovery Services pending review. When the hearing ended, Margaret sat quietly for several seconds while people gathered their papers. Then, she slowly stood beside Daniel's wheelchair, one hand resting on Rex's back. And Nathan noticed something had changed in her posture. For the first time since he'd met her, Margaret Doyle no longer looked like a woman apologizing for surviving. Winter began to loosen its grip on Silver Creek, not all at once, but in small signs Nathan noticed each morning. Thinner ice along the steps, softer wind between the pines, patches of dark earth showing under the melting snow. After the hearing, Northern Family Recovery Services slowly came apart. Claire called with short updates every few days, while Helen handled the legal work. Margaret recovered control of the remaining Doyle property. Daniel was accepted into a rehabilitation program for disabled patients, and prosecutors in more than one county began reviewing the organization's contracts. None of it felt like celebration inside the cabin. It felt more like breathing again after being held underwater too long. Daniel's first therapy sessions left him silent for hours afterward. He hated needing help into the clinic, hated the metal support frame, hated the way his hands shook when his legs refused to obey. But he kept going. Rex stayed beside him through each session, close enough that Daniel could feel the dog's warmth against his knee whenever he faltered. The therapist, Curtis Vale, was a sturdy man in his early 50s with close-cropped gray hair, dark skin, and a slight limp from an old military injury. He never pitied Daniel, and that made Daniel listen. "You want easy?" Curtis asked one afternoon. "Stay in the chair." Daniel gripped the bars, breathing hard. "And if I don't?" "Then take one more step." Daniel took it. Then another. Margaret covered her mouth with a trembling hand, and Nathan looked away before anyone could see what the moment did to him. As the weeks passed, Nathan's cabin changed without anyone naming it. Margaret began cooking every evening, declaring that men who lived on canned soup and black coffee couldn't be trusted with their own survival. Daniel repaired small things from his chair: loose hinges, crooked shelves, a broken drawer handle by the sink. Rex carried socks, gloves, and sometimes tools in his mouth with the proud seriousness of a working dog, convinced the whole household depended on him. Nathan still chopped wood, fixed the roof, and drove into town, but now he came back to voices inside instead of silence. That was the part that unsettled him most. For years, silence had been safe. After his mother died when he was 14, Nathan had learned not to expect anyone waiting in a kitchen, and the Marines had hardened that lesson until solitude felt normal. But now, Margaret always looked up when he stepped inside. "Roads bad?" she'd ask. And somehow that small question stayed with him longer than it should. One afternoon, Helen called to say the old Doyle house in town was legally safe to enter again. Margaret thanked her politely, then sat at the table a long time without speaking. The next morning Nathan drove her there, while Daniel stayed at the cabin with Rex after a hard therapy session. The house looked better than he expected. A county crew had secured the porch, changed the locks, covered a broken window. But Margaret stopped in the doorway like a woman standing before something that had once loved her, and then failed to protect her. Inside, the rooms were clean but cold. The kitchen still held the faint outline where a table had once stood. Margaret walked slowly from one doorway to the next, touching nothing, memories moving across her face: Daniel before the accident, her late husband's chair, bills spread across the table, strangers smiling over papers she didn't understand. "This is yours again," Nathan said quietly. Margaret looked toward the window where pale spring light fell across the floor. "Yes," she whispered. "But it doesn't feel like mine." Nathan said nothing. She turned to him, eyes tired but clear. "I thought getting it back would make me feel safe." She drew a slow breath. "But all I can remember is being afraid here." That evening she returned to Nathan's cabin quieter than usual. Daniel understood before she explained. He didn't argue or push her toward the old house. He only reached for her hand when she sat beside him near the stove. "You don't have to go back," he said. Margaret looked at him, surprised by the gentleness in his voice. "But it was your father's house." Daniel shook his head. "No, it was ours when we were safe there." He glanced around Nathan's cabin, where Rex slept by the fire, and Nathan stood at the door holding a bundle of wood. "This place saved us." Nathan lowered his eyes a moment, because hearing it made the room feel suddenly smaller. By late spring, Daniel could cross the cabin floor using his frame, while Rex walked beside him like a shadow. Margaret no longer asked permission before using the kitchen. Nathan no longer corrected her when she moved his coffee mug, folded his shirts, or scolded him for working outside without gloves. The house filled with small, ordinary sounds: soup simmering, Daniel muttering at the radio, Rex's paws thudding across the floor, Margaret humming while she cut vegetables. None of it looked like a miracle from the outside, but to Nathan, who had spent half his life returning to empty rooms, It felt almost impossible. The moment came on a cold evening after the last snow had begun melting from the woodpile. Nathan stepped inside carrying split logs against his chest, his boots leaving wet marks by the door, and Rex trotted over to inspect him as if he'd come back from war instead of the yard. Daniel sat by the window practicing slow movements with his frame, jaw tight but determined. Margaret stood at the stove stirring soup, sleeves rolled above her thin wrists, gray hair pinned loosely behind her head. Without turning around, she said, "Nathan, son, bring me that pot from the shelf." The cabin went still. Margaret froze first, the wooden spoon in her hand. Daniel looked up slowly. Rex stopped beside Nathan's boot and tilted his head. Nathan stood in the doorway with the firewood still against his chest, unable to move. The word had landed somewhere deep and old inside him, in a place he thought grief had sealed shut years ago. No one had called him son since his mother died. Margaret turned, embarrassed and pale. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to." Nathan set the wood down carefully and crossed the kitchen. He reached the shelf, took down the pot, and set it beside her on the stove. "It's all right," he said, his voice rough. Margaret looked at him a long second, then nodded. She said nothing more, and neither did he. But when Nathan sat down at the table that night, Daniel pushed a bowl toward him. Rex settled at his feet, and Margaret served soup like she'd been doing it all his life. Outside, the snow kept melting into the dark earth. Inside, the cabin stayed warm. Sometimes God doesn't send his miracles the way we expect. Sometimes he sends them quietly. Through a warm bowl of soup. Through a loyal dog waiting beside someone in pain. Through a stranger who chooses kindness when the world has turned cold. In the middle of loneliness and loss and hardship, God can still place the right people in our path at exactly the right moment. This story reminds us that so many people around us are fighting battles we can't see. A small act of compassion may be the very reason someone keeps going one more day. And sometimes, when we help save another person, we slowly heal the broken parts inside ourselves too. If this story touched your heart, share where you're watching from in the comments, and tell me about someone who once showed you kindness during a hard season of life. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more emotional stories about loyalty, hope, healing, and the unbreakable bond between people and dogs. May God bless you, protect your family, bring peace to your home, and remind you that even in the coldest winters of life, you are never truly alone.